The evening class was held in a quiet community college on the edge of town. The classroom was not too big, but it was filled with students of different ages who came after work or school to learn something extra. Most of them were in their 20s or 30s, but that night, something unusual caught everyone's attention. An old woman slowly entered the room, holding a worn-out notebook and a small pen. She walked carefully, her steps steady but slow, as if every move carried years of stories. Her name was Margaret. She wore a plain cardigan, a long skirt, and simple shoes. Her silver hair was tied neatly at the back, and her face had the gentle lines of time, showing wisdom and patience. When she walked in, the younger students whispered among themselves. Some were curious, others were amused. "What is she doing here?" one boy whispered. "Maybe she got lost," another girl joked. They tried to keep their voices low, but Margaret could feel their eyes on her. Still, she smiled politely and took a seat at the corner desk. The teacher, Mr. Collins, walked in soon after. He was a man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a strict posture. He believed in discipline and often acted as if he knew more than anyone else. He quickly noticed Margaret sitting at the back. He paused, looked at her from head to toe, and raised an eyebrow. His first thought was that she did not belong there. In his mind, math classes were for sharp young minds, not for someone who looked like a grandmother. "Good evening, everyone," Mr. Collins began, his voice loud and commanding. The class responded in unison, "Good evening, sir." Then he glanced again at Margaret. "I see we have a new student tonight," he said slowly, with a hint of doubt in his tone. Margaret nodded kindly. "Yes, I thought I would join. I always wanted to study mathematics," she said softly. The teacher smirked. "Mathematics is not exactly easy, you know. It's not knitting or baking. It takes focus, speed, and sharpness." His words carried a hidden sting, and a few students chuckled under their breath. Margaret did not argue. She simply folded her hands on the desk and replied, "I understand. I will do my best." As the class went on, Mr. Collins wrote equations on the board, explaining them in his usual fast manner. Most of the students struggled to keep up, but Margaret quietly took notes. Her handwriting was neat and steady. Whenever she raised her hand to ask a question, the teacher's face tightened. He did not like being interrupted, especially by someone he assumed could not understand. "That's basic, MRS, he asked, waiting for her name. "Margaret," she answered calmly. "Yes, Margaret. That's something we covered already. You'll need to pay attention if you want to keep up," Mr. Collins said, almost dismissively. A few students laughed again. Margaret only smiled faintly and lowered her hand. She did not let his words discourage her. The minutes passed, and the class continued. Margaret followed along carefully. When other students were busy whispering, yawning, or checking their phones under the table, she was fully focused on every number and every formula. Her eyes sparkled with interest, though no one else noticed it. Halfway through the lesson, Mr. Collins gave a practice problem to the class. It was a simple one, according to him. He called on a young man in the front row to solve it on the board. The boy tried but made mistakes. Mr. Collins sighed and corrected him harshly. Then he asked another student, a girl sitting in the middle. She too stumbled halfway through. As the teacher grew frustrated, his eyes landed on Margaret again. He thought for a moment, then gave a small smile, not of kindness, but of challenge. "Perhaps our new student would like to give it a try," he asked, his tone sharp. The class turned to look at her. Some students smirked, others whispered, "This will be fun." Margaret did not flinch. She stood up slowly, gathered her notebook, and walked to the board. Her steps were careful but sure. She picked up the chalk, her hand steady, and looked at the problem written on the board. It was not as simple as Mr. Collins had claimed. For most beginners, it was a little complicated. But Margaret studied it quietly for a few seconds. She then began to write, her movements calm and deliberate. At first, the students leaned back, expecting her to make mistakes. They thought she would freeze or give up. But instead, she broke the problem into small steps, solving each one clearly. The chalk made a soft sound as she wrote carefully, and the numbers lined up neatly across the board. Mr. Collins crossed his arms, pretending not to care, but inside he was watching closely. Something about her method was unusual. It was clean, logical, and precise. When Margaret finished, she placed the chalk down and stepped aside. The answer was correct. The classroom went quiet. No one laughed this time. Instead, there were murmurs of surprise. She actually got it right, one student whispered. Another muttered, "That was fast." Margaret turned to Mr. Collins and gave a small, humble smile. "Like this?" she asked. The teacher blinked, his face stiff. He nodded slowly, trying not to show his shock. "Yes, correct," he said, his voice lower than usual. She returned to her seat quietly, without boasting. The younger students stared at her differently now. Some were curious, others impressed. Mr. Collins, however, was unsettled. In his mind, this was not supposed to happen. He had expected her to fail, to prove his doubts right. But instead, she had solved the problem better than his younger students. The rest of the class went on, but the atmosphere had changed. Margaret sat calmly, continuing to take notes, while Mr. Collins grew more tense. Deep down, he began to wonder if this old woman might be more than what she appeared to be. By the end of the session, as students packed their bags, whispers filled the air again. But this time, they were not mocking. They were curious, even respectful. Margaret simply smiled, thanked the teacher, and left the room slowly, her notebook held close to her chest. Little did they know, this was only the beginning. The next class began a few days later. The sun had already set when Margaret walked slowly into the room with her same calm smile and her worn-out notebook. This time, the atmosphere in the classroom was a little different. The students no longer looked at her with mocking smiles, instead, they whispered in surprise and curiosity. Some nodded politely when she passed by, and others stared at her as if they were still trying to understand how she had solved the problem so easily in the last class. Mr. Collins stood near the chalkboard, arranging his notes and trying to appear calm, but inside he was unsettled. He remembered clearly how the old woman had solved the previous equation without hesitation, almost making him look small in front of his students. His pride as a teacher felt challenged, and he could not let that happen again. He believed he needed to test her further, to show the class that her success was just luck. As soon as everyone settled, Mr. Collins started with a short review of the previous lesson. He spoke quickly, trying to sound confident. "Now, today," he said with a firm voice, "we will move to a higher level. Mathematics requires more than luck. It requires skill, practice, and intelligence." His eyes glanced at Margaret as he spoke, though he did not mention her name. The students sensed his tone. They knew he was preparing to test her again. Some leaned forward, waiting for the moment when the teacher would call on her. Margaret, however, did not seem nervous. She carefully wrote in her notebook, her silver hair glowing faintly under the classroom lights. After finishing the review, Mr. Collins picked up a piece of chalk and began writing a long equation on the board. The numbers and symbols stretched across almost the entire surface. It was not just a simple problem, it was the kind of complex equation that would make even advanced students pause. The room grew quiet as the students studied the board, their eyes wide. "This," Mr. Collins said, tapping the chalk against the board, "is an equation that requires real understanding. Let's see if anyone here is ready for it. His voice carried a challenge, and once again, his eyes stopped on Margaret. Perhaps our newest student would like to demonstrate her ability again. The room filled with whispers. Some students looked excited, while others felt uneasy for her. A boy in the front row muttered, "This is impossible, even I can't solve this." A girl near the window whispered, "He's trying to embarrass her." Margaret did not frown, nor did she hesitate. She slowly stood up, held her notebook close, and walked toward the board. Her calm steps echoed in the silent classroom. She reached for the chalk, and for a moment, she simply looked at the problem. The symbols and numbers seemed intimidating to everyone else, but to her, they were like old friends she had not seen in years. She touched her glasses and began. Her voice was gentle but clear as she explained each step while writing. First, we separate the variables, then we reduce this part. Her handwriting was steady, her movements careful but confident. She worked as though she had been solving such problems all her life. The students leaned in, captivated. Their notebooks lay forgotten as they watched her hand glide across the board. She broke the problem into smaller parts that suddenly looked simple. She used techniques they had never seen explained so clearly before. Her explanation was not rushed, but it was sharp. Whispers turned into murmurs of amazement. One student whispered, "She's teaching better than the teacher," another added, "I finally understand what this means." Mr. Collins stood stiff, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. At first, he expected her to stumble, but as the solution unfolded step by step, he realized she was not only solving the problem correctly, she was doing it with elegance and clarity he himself rarely achieved. His pride burned inside him, but he tried to keep his face calm. After several minutes, Margaret placed the chalk down. On the board was the completed solution, neat and correct. She turned slightly and smiled at the class, not in triumph, but in quiet satisfaction. "That is the answer," she said softly. The room was silent for a moment. Then, one by one, students began clapping. It started with a hesitant clap from the middle row, then spread quickly until the entire classroom was filled with applause. Margaret looked surprised but bowed her head politely, her cheeks turning slightly pink. Mr. Collins did not clap. He stood frozen, staring at the solution. His pride told him to find a mistake, to point out something wrong, but there was nothing. Every line was correct. Every step was clear. He could not argue with the truth written on the board. The class finally settled, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Students looked at Margaret not as an old woman out of place, but as someone extraordinary. Some of them even began to ask her questions directly during the break, seeking her guidance. Margaret helped them kindly, explaining with patience and kindness, never making anyone feel small. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins sat at his desk, lost in thought. He was struggling with his own emotions. On one hand, he admired her brilliance. On the other hand, he could not accept being overshadowed in his own classroom. His pride whispered to him that he had to put her in her place, but another part of him felt a deep respect he had never admitted before. When the class ended, Margaret gathered her notebook and stood up. Several students came to her, thanking her for the explanation. "You made it so easy to understand," one girl said. "I wish you were the teacher," a boy added half-jokingly, and everyone laughed softly. Margaret only smiled and replied, "Learning is for everyone. We all help each other." Mr. Collins watched this with tight lips. He dismissed the class quickly, but his mind was racing. He realized Margaret's presence was not temporary. She was not just a curious old woman passing time, she was someone who carried real knowledge, the kind that could inspire the whole class. As Margaret walked out, the hallway lights shone gently on her silver hair. She looked peaceful, almost as if she had no idea she had just shaken the confidence of the teacher himself. But inside Mr. Collins's heart, a storm was building. He knew he could not ignore her talent any longer. The next time, he decided, he would find a way to truly test her. He would push her to the edge, to see just how deep her genius ran. The class, however, had already chosen their side. In their eyes, Margaret was no longer just another student. She was someone to admire, someone who proved that wisdom and intelligence never aged. The stage was set for something greater, and everyone could feel it. The next week arrived, and the classroom felt different even before the lesson began. Students came in earlier than usual, chatting in small groups about the last class. Some were still amazed by how Margaret had solved the impossible equation so calmly, while others wondered what the teacher would do next. It seemed as though everyone was waiting for another surprise. Margaret walked in with her quiet grace, carrying the same notebook and pen. She smiled at the students who nodded at her politely now, not mockingly. The respect in their eyes was clear. They had seen something special, and they were curious to see more. She settled into her usual seat in the corner, her hands folded on the desk as she waited patiently. Mr. Collins entered shortly after. His steps were firm, his expression sharp, but his eyes betrayed a storm inside. He had been thinking about Margaret all week. He was not the kind of man to accept being overshadowed, especially not by an old woman he had once dismissed as out of place. Yet, he could not deny her brilliance. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her writing on the board, breaking down the problem with elegance and ease. His pride was wounded, and he knew today he had to take back control. "Good evening," he greeted the class, his voice a little tighter than usual. The students responded in unison, and silence fell. He began by reviewing some basic concepts, but his pace was faster than usual, almost as if he was rushing towards something. Finally, he stopped, turned to the board, and began to write. The chalk screeched lightly against the surface as he filled the board with a problem far more complex than anything the class had seen before. The equation stretched across the board like a puzzle made of symbols, fractions, and roots that twisted into a web of confusion. Even the brightest students exchanged nervous glances. Some whispered, "This looks impossible," while others simply stared in silence. Mr. Collins stepped back and looked at the class. "This," he said, "is not an ordinary problem. It is advanced. Very advanced. It requires true intelligence to solve. Let us see if anyone can even attempt it." His eyes shifted toward Margaret. The students followed his gaze. They already knew what was coming. Some leaned forward in excitement, others in concern. "He's really going to test her," someone whispered. Margaret, however, did not hesitate. She rose gently from her seat, notebook in hand, and walked toward the board. She picked up the chalk, studied the equation for a few moments, and then began. Her hand moved slowly at first, carefully outlining the steps. She spoke softly, explaining, "We must first separate this part here. Then we balance both sides, step by step." The classroom grew silent, so silent that one could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The students watched her every movement. What looked like a mess of symbols to them was slowly unraveling into order under her touch. As she worked, her confidence grew. The chalk moved smoothly across the board, breaking the problem into smaller, understandable pieces. Her explanations were clear, as if she were not only solving the problem but also teaching at the same time. Some students scribbled notes furiously, realizing they were learning more from her demonstration than from the teacher's lectures. Mr. Collins's face grew tense. He leaned against his desk, arms crossed, but his fingers tapped nervously. He wanted her to make a mistake, to falter, but she did not. Instead, her solution flowed like a steady river, calm and precise. Minutes passed, but to the class, it felt like a story unfolding before their eyes. Margaret wrote the final line of the solution and underlined the answer. Then she placed the chalk back on the tray and turned toward the class. "And that," she said gently, "is the correct solution." There was silence for a heartbeat, and then the room erupted into applause. This time, the clapping was louder, more genuine, filled with admiration. Some students even stood from their chairs to clap harder. Margaret blushed slightly, lowering her eyes in humility, but the respect in the room was undeniable. Mr. Collins felt a sharp pain of defeat in his chest. He forced a smile, though it was stiff. "Yes, well, that is correct," he admitted reluctantly. His voice was quieter than before. The students exchanged glances, they could see the change in their teacher. During the short break, students gathered around Margaret. They asked her to explain parts of the problem, and she did so with patience, smiling warmly at each question. "You see, if you break it down slowly, it becomes less frightening," she said kindly. Her words carried encouragement, not pride. The students listened with genuine respect, as if she were their true mentor. Mr. Collins watched from his desk, his pride battling with reality. He wanted to dislike her for stealing the spotlight, but deep down, he could not ignore what he saw. She was brilliant, far beyond what he expected. For the first time, he felt something unusual: respect mixed with envy. When the break ended, Mr. Collins called the class back to order. He avoided looking directly at Margaret, but he addressed the group with a more thoughtful tone. "Mathematics," he said slowly, "is not only about numbers. It is about patience, understanding, and a clear mind." His words were different, softer, as if he had been forced to admit something even to himself. As the lesson ended and the students packed their bags, the whispers in the room were no longer mocking or curious. They were filled with admiration. "She's amazing," one student said. "I wish I had her brain," another added. Margaret, however, remained humble. She thanked the teacher, wished the students good night, and walked out quietly, her silver hair shining under the dim lights of the hallway. She had not come to prove herself, she had only come to learn. Yet without realizing it, she was changing the way everyone saw her. Outside, the night air was cool, and Margaret breathed deeply as she walked home. She felt content, not because of the applause, but because she had reconnected with the part of herself she thought she had lost long ago, the part that loved solving problems, the part that loved learning. Inside the classroom, Mr. Collins lingered alone for a few minutes after everyone left. He stared at the board, at the clean solution Margaret had left behind. His pride was bruised, but his mind was restless. He knew this was only the beginning. If he wanted to understand who she really was, he would need to learn more about her past. And so, the stage was set. The old woman who once seemed out of place was now the center of attention, and her quiet genius was forcing everyone, including her teacher, to see her in a new light. The following week, the classroom was buzzing before the lesson even started. Students were not talking about the teacher's strict rules or the assignments due. They were whispering about Margaret, the quiet old woman who had turned into the star of the class. Some called her a genius, while others compared her to a professor. A few students even admitted they had finally understood math concepts only after listening to her clear explanations. When Margaret entered the room, she noticed the change right away. The students greeted her with warm smiles, some even pulling out a chair for her. She thanked them politely, her face glowing with modesty. She did not expect or demand attention, but it followed her wherever she went. Mr. Collins, however, sat at his desk with a heavy expression. He had been restless all week. His pride was still bruised, and he could not stop thinking about how easily Margaret had solved every problem he set before her. He had always believed himself to be the authority in the classroom, the one everyone looked up to. But now, the attention was shifting. Students were asking her for guidance, not him. He felt as though his role was slipping away. When the lesson began, Mr. Collins tried to carry on as usual, but his tone was sharper, his pace faster. It was as though he was trying to prove something, not to his students, but to himself. He gave out multiple practice problems, pacing the room with quick steps, his hands clasped behind his back. Finally, he stopped and turned to the class. Mathematics, he began in a deep, firm voice, is not only about solving problems. It is about discipline, dedication, and years of study. Knowledge does not simply appear, it is earned. His words were heavy, almost directed at Margaret without saying her name. The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew what he meant. They glanced at Margaret, but she sat calmly, her notebook open, her eyes kind and steady. She did not argue. Then, Mr. Collins made his move. He walked to the board and began writing again. But this time, it was not just a difficult equation. It was a problem mixed with multiple layers of concepts, something closer to graduate-level work than what was expected in their class. His chalk scratched furiously as he filled the board with symbols, fractions, and formulas until the surface was nearly covered. When he finished, he turned around with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "This," he announced, "is not from your syllabus. It is from advanced mathematical research. It took scholars years to understand problems like these. If anyone here can solve this, I will personally admit that they deserve my full respect." The students grew silent. They knew who he was looking at. Everyone turned toward Margaret. Some whispered, "This is unfair." Others whispered, "She can do it." Margaret stood slowly, her notebook in hand. She did not look offended or nervous. Instead, she walked gently to the board, her steps calm and unhurried. She studied the enormous equation for a long moment, her eyes scanning every corner of the board. The class waited in silence, their hearts pounding. At last, Margaret picked up the chalk. Her voice was soft but steady as she began, "We must first reduce this large fraction here. Then we can focus on simplifying the square root." She wrote carefully, each line neat and precise. The students leaned forward in amazement. Step by step, she untangled the problem. What had seemed like chaos began to make sense under her hand. Her explanations flowed like a teacher's lesson, clear enough for everyone to understand. She did not rush. She paused at each important step, making sure the logic was visible. The students whispered to one another in awe. "She's incredible. How does she know this? She's teaching us more than the actual teacher." Mr. Collins watched closely. At first, he expected her to falter, but instead, he felt his face heat with disbelief. She was solving it perfectly. Every symbol she wrote was correct, every line followed logical order. His pride crumbled with each step she completed. Finally, Margaret reached the last part of the problem. With steady hands, she simplified the expression, wrote the final answer, and underlined it. She placed the chalk down and turned toward the class. "That is the solution," she said softly, almost modestly. The room erupted into applause again, louder than before. Some students even stood up, clapping with admiration. One of them shouted, "You're amazing." Another said, "You should be the professor." Laughter and cheers filled the room, not out of mockery, but out of genuine joy and respect. Margaret blushed slightly and raised her hands to quiet them. "Please," she said kindly, "I am only here to learn. We are all students. We must never stop learning, no matter our age." But her words did not reduce the admiration. If anything, they deepened it. The students saw her not just as a genius, but as someone humble and wise. Mr. Collins, however, stood frozen. His lips pressed into a tight line, his pride crushed. He could not deny what he had seen. She had solved something that many professionals struggled with, and she had done it with clarity and grace. One brave student finally asked the question everyone was thinking, "Margaret, how do you know all this?" Were you a teacher before? The room went quiet, waiting for her answer. Margaret hesitated for a moment, then smiled faintly. No, I was never a teacher. But many years ago, I studied mathematics at the university. I loved it dearly. I even worked on some research projects. But life took me in another direction. I had a family to care for, responsibilities that needed me more than my studies. So, I set it aside. But I never forgot. I still solved problems at home, in my notebooks, late at night. It has always been my passion. The students were stunned. Their jaws dropped, and their eyes widened. The humble old woman who walked into their class like a stranger had once been a brilliant scholar. She had carried this knowledge quietly for decades, hidden beneath a simple life. Even Mr. Collins could not remain silent. His voice was lower now, softer, filled with something he had never shown before: respect. So, you were a researcher, he said quietly. Margaret nodded gently. Yes, many years ago. But that was another life. Now, I am simply here to learn again. The students clapped once more, not only for her intelligence, but for her courage and humility. They admired her story, her dedication, and her love for learning. For them, she had become more than a classmate, she was an inspiration. Mr. Collins lowered his eyes. His pride had been humbled completely. For the first time, he realized that true wisdom was not measured by age, position, or authority, but by passion and perseverance. As the class ended, students crowded around Margaret, asking her questions, thanking her for explaining things so clearly. She smiled and helped each one, never showing a trace of arrogance. She walked out of the classroom that night with the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing to prove, yet had changed everything. Inside, Mr. Collins remained behind for a long time, staring at the empty board where her solution still shone like a quiet victory. He finally whispered to himself, I was wrong about her. I was wrong. And with that, the story of the old woman's genius spread through the campus like wildfire. The days after Margaret revealed her past were filled with whispers and admiration around the campus. Students from other classes began hearing about her. Some of them peeked into the classroom just to catch a glimpse of the woman who had left a strict teacher speechless. It was as if Margaret had become a legend within the small community college. When the next class started, the seats filled up earlier than usual. Students who never cared about arriving on time now rushed to get a spot. Some who were not even registered for the course slipped in quietly, pretending they belonged there, only to see Margaret in action again. The atmosphere was buzzing with energy and expectation. Margaret walked in at her usual pace, wearing the same simple cardigan and carrying her old notebook. She did not seem affected by all the attention. Her smile was gentle, and her eyes calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. To her, she was still just a student. But to everyone else, she had become a symbol of hidden brilliance and quiet strength. Mr. Collins stood at the front, his expression unreadable. Over the last few weeks, his pride had been tested again and again. Each time, Margaret had proven him wrong, not with arrogance, but with grace. He had tried to trap her with difficult problems, but instead, she had taught the entire class lessons he himself struggled to explain. At first, he had been angry and defensive, but now something inside him had changed. He could no longer deny her intelligence, nor could he deny the respect she deserved. He cleared his throat as the class began. Today, he said, we are going to review everything we have covered. But more importantly, I want us to discuss what mathematics really means, not just numbers, but life itself. His tone was different. It was softer, more thoughtful, as though he was no longer trying to prove anything, but to learn alongside them. The students noticed the shift. They glanced at one another, surprised by the change in their strict teacher. They knew it had something to do with Margaret. As the lesson went on, Margaret participated as usual, asking questions, giving insights, and even helping her classmates when they struggled. But today, something unusual happened. Instead of avoiding her, Mr. Collins began asking her to share her methods openly. "Margaret," he said at one point, "would you explain this step to the class? You seem to have a way of making it easier to understand." The students turned to her eagerly. Margaret stood, adjusted her glasses, and explained the solution step by step, her voice patient and clear. The class listened in silence, taking notes quickly. Some even smiled, realizing that they were finally enjoying mathematics because of her. Mr. Collins stood by, watching her carefully. This time, there was no envy in his eyes. There was respect. When she finished, he nodded deeply. "Thank you, Margaret," he said. His words were simple, but for him, they carried a weight he had never shown before. As the weeks passed, Margaret's presence transformed the classroom. Students no longer feared difficult problems, they faced them with curiosity, inspired by her example. Many began staying after class, working together in groups, and Margaret often sat among them, guiding and encouraging. She did not take over the teacher's role, but her influence made everyone better. One evening, after a particularly challenging lesson, a shy student approached her. "Mrs. Margaret," he said nervously, "I always thought I was terrible at math. I almost quit this class. But because of you, I feel like maybe I can do it. Thank you." His words made her eyes soften with emotion. She gently patted his shoulder. "Never give up," she said kindly. "It is never too late to learn, and never too late to shine." Her words spread quietly, touching hearts far beyond the classroom. Other students began sharing their own struggles and victories, and Margaret listened to each one with patience. She became more than a classmate, she became a mentor, a guide, and even a friend. Mr. Collins noticed this transformation. For years, he had taught with discipline and authority, but rarely with warmth. Margaret had shown him something he had forgotten, that teaching was not about power, but about inspiring others. One evening after class, he stayed behind while Margaret packed her things. He hesitated before speaking, his voice lower than usual. "Margaret," he said slowly, "I owe you an apology. When you first joined this class, I doubted you. I even tried to embarrass you. But instead, you have taught me and my students more than I could have imagined. You reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place. So, thank you." Margaret smiled kindly, her eyes warm. "You do not need to apologize, Mr. Collins. We are all learning, no matter our age or position. You have your strengths, and I have mine. That is what makes learning beautiful." For the first time, Mr. Collins smiled back, not the stiff smile he usually wore, but a genuine one. He realized then that wisdom could come from anyone, even from the person he had underestimated most. As the semester came to an end, the classroom had changed completely. The students no longer saw mathematics as something to fear. They approached it with excitement, ready to challenge themselves. Margaret continued to come every week, her love for learning as strong as ever. She had not only solved equations, she had solved the doubts and fears of those around her. On the last day of class, the students decided to do something special. When Margaret entered the room, she found the board filled with messages written in colorful chalk. "Thank you, Margaret. You inspire us. Our genius." The students stood and clapped as she walked in, their smiles wide and genuine. Margaret gasped softly, her eyes shining with tears. She had never expected such love and respect. She raised her hands, trying to quiet the applause, but her voice trembled as she spoke. "Thank you, my dear friends. You have given me more than I could ever ask for. I came here only to learn, but I found a family. Remember, no matter where life takes you, Never stop learning, never stop believing in yourselves. The applause grew louder, echoing through the halls. Even Mr. Collins clapped, his face filled with pride and respect. That night, as Margaret walked home under the quiet stars, she felt lighter than she had in years. She knew she had rediscovered a part of herself she thought was gone. She had proved that passion and wisdom never grow old. And in the hearts of every student, her story remained forever a story of humility, brilliance, and the power of never giving up.